Hello, everyone. We are so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome our friend Ron Chernow and his book, Mark Twain. And we'd like to thank viewers like you who make book breaks possible every week. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'll be joined by my friend Ryan in the second half, who's going to take all your questions. And without further ado, we're so thrilled to welcome Ron Chernow, a Pulitzer Prize winning author. His biography of Alexander Hamilton received the inaugural George Washington Prize and inspired the popular musical Hamilton, for which he worked as a historical consultant. And he's also served as an amazing friend to the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Ron, we're so thrilled to have you here today.
It's my great pleasure to join you, Gina. Thank you.
Now, just to begin, can you give us a brief overview of this work?
Yeah, well, this is what's called in the trade a cradle to grave biography. And I guess one way of distinguishing it from other biographies would be this. Back in the 1990s, I remember Ken Burns did a 4-hour, two-part documentary series on Mark Twain, which I watched with great interest. The first part was the familiar Mark Twain. It was the Mark Twain of Huck and Tom and Life on the Mississippi. And it had quite a jovial atmosphere to it. But it was the second part that in many ways intrigued me even more because the first part was one of literary triumph. The second part was one of personal tragedy, business failure, calamities in the family, death, exile, etc. And as a biographer, one of the things that appealed to me was that combination of light and shadow, and to see if I could merge the two sides of his life, because there's the familiar Mark Twain, who is charming and genial and irreverent, and we picture in the white suit, holding the cigar and spouting witticisms, and we'd like to think of him with a merry twinkle in his eye. Then there was also kind of the darker, moodier, Mark Twain below the surface, both true. And so I was trying to capture the man whole. I argue in the book that this is the largest literary personality that America has produced. And he turned out to be an extremely, extremely fascinating, but also very, very complicated man.
Yeah, and his childhood is so fascinating. And you write about his parents and their sort of loveless relationship. How did that shape him?
Tremendously. Well, his father, John Marshall Clemens, was a very cold and distant man, and it was clear that young Samuel Clemens feared his father. He said later that they were always on the most distant terms. He said what amounted to an armed neutrality, a rather chilling term, isn't it? Another time he said that my knowledge of my father amounted to little more than an introduction. Again, very cool way of describing your father. It's interesting that the father who found humor in nothing spawned this son who found humor in everything. And of
Everything.
course, the naughty boy turned out to be the naughty author. I think that the influence of his father died when he was 11, was great. I think that it left him with a permanent mistrust of authority figures. He feared his father. I think the humor was a way of kind of deflecting and dealing with that anger. Also, his father had failed in business 4 or 5 times. So it left Mark Twain with a permanent dread of poverty that would have fatal consequences in his life. Now, offsetting that was the wonderful mother, Jane Lambton Clemens, who was a pretty high-spirited woman. She loved to dance. She loved to wear the color red. She loved any spectacle, from a circus to a funeral. And she had exactly the same slow drawl and dry wit and plain-spoken eloquence of her famous son. My favorite story about her, which will make the point, was Mark Twain was a premature child. He was a sickly runt. And in later years, he asked Jane Lambton Clemens whether she had been worried about him when he was a baby. And she said, oh, yes, all the time. And Twain persisted and said, afraid I wouldn't make it. And then with a deadpan absolutely worthy of the famous son, she said to him, no, afraid you would. It's such a Mark Twain kind of line that it's rather startling, it's sort of dry, it's shocking, it's unexpected. And so I think that from her, he got this wit, he got this warmth. And also, I think that he would always find women much more emotionally accessible than men. He had many, many acquaintances in his life, but very few true male friends.
Yeah, and just again, because we have so much ground to cover,
Yeah.
one moment that really fascinated me was his support of John Bell in the 1860 election. Can you tell us what did that say about sort of his political views at that time?
Yeah, well, okay. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which is tucked up way in the northeast corner of Missouri on the Mississippi River. So he grew up in a slave-owning family, in a slave-owning town, in a slave-owning state. I think what it said was that he was strongly for the Union. We know that he opposed secession, which is not to say that he opposed slavery. He came to very militantly oppose, slavery in time. But I think that he was very, very conflicted, as were many people in Missouri, which was a state that was really kind of riven, by the two sides in the conflict. He did serve. He had been a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi. As soon as the Civil War broke out, steamboat traffic shut down. For 2 weeks, he joined a rather ragtag pro-Confederate militia. He did not cover himself with glory. In fact, he later said, I knew more about retreating than the man who invented retreating. He was very lucky that at that moment, his older brother, Orion, was appointed secretary of the Nevada Territory and decided to take along his kid brother, Sam, as his private secretary. And I think that for Twain, it took him out of this excruciating dilemma that he was feeling about the war. And it's interesting, I tried to point out in the book that it was always very difficult to get straight answers from Mark Twain in terms of what he was feeling politically at that time. And that he was conflicted about it because he almost always played his service in this Confederate militia for laughs, which I think was a way of masking the conflict for him. And it's interesting because later on, he not only becomes very sort of Union, pro-Northern in his sympathies, but he becomes very close friends with Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Phil Sheridan, not
Well,
with any Confederate generals, but he seems to get to know every Northern general. In fact, publishes all of their memoirs. So he undergoes a kind of complete makeover politically.
right. The Longstreet was the only Confederate general, right, who was sort of, you know, right, that he was semi close to.
Yeah, because Longstreet, as you know, is very courageous after the war in terms of being sympathetic with Reconstruction, which most of the other Confederate generals were not. And so that was kind of very fortunate for Mark Twain, that not only that he was pulled away from the Civil War and did not have to deal with all of his conflicts and complexities, but it puts him out in Nevada at the time of the Comstock load. And there's this frenzied money madness of everyone trying to make an overnight fortune, including Sam Clemens. And Clemens was very preoccupied with money throughout his life. Again, I think going back to the father's repeated business failures, he tried his hand at mining and failed. And he then miraculously got an offer from the local newspaper called the Territorial Enterprise to become their city editor. He made this very funny comment. He said, Chris, he said yes. He later said, if I had been offered a job translating the Talmud from the original Hebrew into English, I would have accepted it. He was that desperate for money. And then they hire him. He had worked, his brother Orion had a newspaper in Missouri. Sam had worked as a printer's devil and occasionally would introduce satiric squibs into the newspaper. So he had a little bit of a journalism background, but he said that his first day on the job at the Territorial Enterprise, he was filled with sudden panic in terms of how he was going to fill his first column. And then he said, a desperado killed a man in a saloon and joy returned once more. And he was really off and running. And it was kind of a wonderful position for him because journalism at that time, or at least that by place in that paper, It was not kind of straight news reporting. It was a very kind of, often funny, individualistic kind of writing. He published hoaxes and told tales. He engaged in running battles with journalists from other newspapers. So it really kind of gave scope to this humor, which was always very freewheeling and anarchic and kind of chaotic. So and of course, he found himself, as he had been on the Mississippi, in this place where the whole world of crazy characters seemed to be passing by, and he's storing up all of this material for future use.
Yes. And speaking of this, can you talk about the moment when Samuel Clemens becomes Mark Twain and how that transformation happens?
Yeah, the pen name Mark Twain, which is such a beautiful and seems like perfect and appropriate name. Okay, so when he's on that newspaper in Nevada, the Territorial Enterprise, a lot of the journalists at that time would adopt pen names, particularly the humorists would adopt pen names. So it's not surprising that he did. And so he reached back into his steamboat days. And what Mark Twain meant, it meant 2 fathoms or 12 feet. And so the so-called leadsman on the boat would drop an anchor over the side just to see how deep, shallow the water was. And if the leadsman then called back up to the pilot, Mark Twain, that meant that there was just kind of, 12 feet to the bottom. So it's very evocative. And I think also it's pithy, as I say in the book, it's a spondy, that it's just, 2 beats. And so it kind of fixes itself in people's imagination. And this turned out to be true of Mark Twain's writing and of his personality. He had a way of impressing himself on the popular imagination.
And yeah, I feel like even, and then in romantic relationships with his wife, even, right? He had to ask her a few times to get married before she accepted.
Yeah, no, actually, he courted for a 2-year period a beautiful young woman named Libby Langdon, who lived in Elmira up in the Finger Lakes district. And Libby was very prim and proper. She was very beautiful. She was sensitive, intelligent. She was about 10 years younger. She was rather fragile physically. And perhaps most important of all, she was an heiress. Her father, Jervis Langdon, who'd been very involved with the abolitionist movement, which is important in terms of changing Mark Twain's views on a lot of things in terms of racial stuff. Mark Twain suddenly sweeps into their life like this tornado. He was just publishing his first book, but he looked seedy and raffish and disreputable, and suddenly here's the book's very proper daughter, Livy, and so Jervis Langdon, the father, liked Mark Twain, and Jervis Langdon had made a fortune in coal and timber and railroads. He used to sell the coal that fired the Vanderbilt's New York Central locomotives. So what he did, because Mark Twain, he sent Livy 200 love letters, and they're long and passionate. And he sent her so many letters that she began to number them. So it's like this kind of tidal wave, rushing over her life. So finally, Jervis Langdon says that Twain should have his friends out from Nevada, and he lived in San Francisco, have them send letters of recommendation. So Jervis Langdon receives 10 letters of recommendation about Mark Twain, and they all describe him as idle and lecherous, a drinker and a humbug. And so Jervis Langdon calls in Mark Twain to discuss these amazing letters, and Langdon says to Twain, "Don't you have a friend in the world?" And Mark Twain kind of sadly says, "I guess not." And Langdon says, "Well, then I'll be your friend instead. I believe in you. Take the girl." And he approved the marriage. And it actually, I think, was really an inspired act of foresight because Mark Twain was clearly a lot to handle. Livy had had this very, very sheltered upbringing. She was very, very literate. In many ways, she was probably better at than Mark Twain was. But she was very refined and very proper. And here's this kind of wild man from the West who's blowing into their lives. And he was a very volatile character, and a lot of the book deals with their marriage, which was absolutely fascinating, the way the interplay.
Yes, and then also want to know what his relationship, his three daughters, which I found so moving, so much of that, just him as a father.
Yeah, I really felt very strongly that I had to tell in some detail the story of the three daughters, because each of the three daughters' stories reveals a very, very different aspect of Mark Twain's life. There's his favorite daughter, Susie, who's very kind of, poetic and effervescent. She goes off to Bryn Mawr. She falls in love with another woman, and it's a romance that goes on for a number of years. Interesting, Mark Twain, who was so chatty on every topic, and it's not, sort of never responds to it. And it's Susie's life, and sadly, I never know how much to give away. Of
Right, I know.
story,
Spoiler
and
alert
then and
there.
then the middle daughter, Clara, who seriously pursues a career as a concert pianist. She fails at that, then she pursues a series of a career as a concert singer, singing classical leader. She spends times in rest homes in sanitaria. And then the youngest daughter, Jean, who was a great conservationist, great lover of animals, suffers from epilepsy. And so all three of the daughters end up presenting tremendous challenges to him. And one of the things that I argue probably at great length in the book is that when the Livy and Twain and the three girls, they had a 17-room mansion. I'm sorry, 25-room mansion in Hartford, 11,500 square feet. Team of loyal servants. Okay, so they have his fortune from book royalties, from lecture fees. Her inheritance. So they're living like plutocrats of the Gilded Age. And the girls, when they're young, for them, father was this magical being who would, invent wonderful stories. He would get down on his hands and knees, and play with them. But he was never able to make the transition from them as children, as teenagers. Then when they became mature women, he didn't quite know how to deal with him. And it's actually um, a weakness in his fiction, that his fiction, of course, heavily, weighted towards, stories of young people. Very few fully rounded, mature women in his fiction. And even there's one point, interestingly, he's collaborating with Bret Hart on a play, and he admits that he can't do the love characters. He can't do the romance, and of course that's no small thing when you're writing a play or a novel, for that matter. So he was aware of that weakness in himself, and even though he presented himself initially to the Langdons as this wild man, there was a kind of prudishness about him, even though he had all these wild times out west. There's not a sense that he had a lot of romance or sex. He writes in one letter home. He said the women like me, but God damn it, they don't love me. So I think that they were people would be charmed and fascinated by him, but I guess he was, for a lot of women, not their romantic ideal. And he develops, and this runs through his whole life, he has this kind of fixation with teenage girls, which seems very, very benign, earlier on, and then takes, more disturbing aspects later on.
Yeah, wow. No, he just is such a fascinating figure in how much he shifts his views. And one of those examples is just the difference the way he portrays Mississippi from Tom Sawyer to Huckleberry Finn. Can you tell us about those contrasts?
Yeah, it's interesting because we tend to think of Mark Twain romanticizing, Hannibal, Missouri, which in the fiction appears as St. Petersburg. And Tom Sawyer is a very kind of charming piece of Americana, of American innocence. Saying the book's kind of like a Currier and Ives print. It's so perfect. But there's sort of one gigantic fact blotted out, and that's slavery. And then when he kind of returns, a decade later, to publish Huck Finn, suddenly not only slavery there, but it's at the center, of the book, and suddenly slavery, he shows, saturates this entire world. And it's interesting because he keeps returning to his boyhood. He keeps returning to his town, and each time he returns to it, the view is darker. Again, from this very idealized picture in Tom Sawyer, then in Huck Finn, a much more sort of realistic portrayal of the way that slavery is distorting all of these people and creating all of this violence. But then, then beyond that, he says about Hannibal, said half the people in Hannibal were alive and half were dead. He said a stranger could not tell them apart. Again, this is the town that he had romanticized. But then one of the most interesting things, and again, this is unpublished, so people are unfamiliar with it. He wrote, so this would have been about 10 years after Huck Finn. He wrote something called Villagers, 1840 to 43. And what he did was he took about 100 people he had grown up with, and he fictionalized their names, but it's pretty clear in many cases who they were, and his own family is in there. And he just gives these capsule summaries of their lives, and they're all shocking, Gina. They're all horrifying. I mean, people are like, oh, she was the prettiest girl in town, and she married, the handsomest guy, and then he turned out to be a drunk, and he beat her, and then he abandoned her. And after he abandoned her, she had an accident in a car, and she broke both her legs, and she was crippled for life. And you have kind of one after another of these very, very dark, tragic stories, and it's like kind of what he hasn't told you about his town. It made me wonder what his career would have been like if he had started taking some of these stories and tried to do justice to it. He would have been Theodore Dreiser, you know what I mean? There would have been, because he was not dealing with, his fiction is very backward looking. He's always returning typically to the years before the Civil Wars, kind of trying to work out that conundrum of slavery. He's living into a time, I mean, it's strange because later on he's living in New York, skyscrapers, he's traveling on the subway, he's living in our modern world and was very fascinated by it, very fascinated by all the technological innovations, but he was not trying to, as a Stephen Crane or a Theodore Dreiser, he was not trying to convert that world into fiction. The soil of his imagination, the fertile soil was that his early years. And I think this happens to a lot of different writers. The problem always is, that when you begin to exhaust that soil, what then happens afterwards is not of the same, quality or intensity. And most people, again, know, Tom Sawyer, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi, maybe those great. He published 24 books. People don't know that he wrote a novel about Joan of Arc. They don't know that he wrote a book about Mary Baker Eddy. They don't know that he wrote a book about Shakespeare, arguing that Shakespeare was a fraud. It was Francis Bacon who wrote all his plays. He even wrote a pornographic satire called 1601, set in the court of Queen Elizabeth the First. So I really tried to, what I did, a lot of those things are not read any longer for a reason. But I found with all of them that there were sort of gems buried in them that I tried to kind of preserve, pieces of it, and assuming people are never going to go back, and read it. But let me give you a little bit of a flavor. And sometimes there are sort of, major pieces, of humor that I wanted to preserve. And I would think to myself, Ron, if you put it in, it becomes part of Mark Twain lore. You keep it alive. If you don't, it's gone forever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the one thing is how enmeshed he was in pop culture and how many words he coined that you didn't even realize. So I was wondering if you had any favorites. Like I loved from the Gilded Age to the idea that he dubbed Annie Sullivan the miracle worker with Helen Keller. Did you have a
I
favorite
know,
word?
yeah. He inscribed something to her and described her as a miracle work, and that became the title both of the musical, the stage play, and the film. Also, his first novel, which he co-authored with Charles Dudley Warner, was called The Gilded Age. That's where we have the term the Gilded Age. In terms of the famous Mark Twain quotes, and I was surprised to discover that these were quotes that he, as it were, manufactured. You could see in his notebook. I mean, some of them were just spontaneous to reporters, but you could also see in his notebook that he was kind of self-consciously coming up with these quotes, because he would rewrite them 5, 10, 20 times until he got exactly the perfect expression. And my two favorites of the many hundreds that he coined, one is my favorite because it's very thought-provoking, and the other is my favorite because it's very funny and apt. The thought-provoking one is the two most important days for our life are the day we were born and the day we figure out why. I think that causes all of us to kind of stop and think, right? And then the other one that I love is good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience. That is the ideal life.
I love that too. Yeah. Now, just as we're sort of winding down in time, just was wondering, your book is so meticulously researched to cover so much of his life. What were your favorite aha moments or discoveries in your research?
I think the thing that surprised me most, I knew that there had been these major business failures. Mark Twain had this fatally alluring fantasy of becoming a tycoon. He
Get
never
rich
just wanted
quick.
to
Yeah.
make a decent return. He wanted to make a killing, and he actually squandered not only his own fortune but Livy's inheritance on this page typesetting machine that he thought would revolutionize the newspaper business. They poured in contemporary dollars at least $6 million into it. They had to leave this beloved house in Hartford. They lived 17 years, and then they went to Europe to live for 9 years to economize. This, our quintessential American writer, lived outside the US for 11 years. What surprised me, Twain was aware of this speculative side. He said, I must speculate, such being my urge. Another time he said, I have often been the easy prey of the cheap adventurer. But what surprised me was that this was really a compulsion, and that he could not stop himself. And even after he went bankrupt and he had to make, not only did they have to live in Europe for 9 years to save money, but he made this rather grueling around the world tour in order to pay off creditors. Even after all of that, he again keeps entering into these speculative binges that he really couldn't control. That I think that, and I didn't realize just quite how compulsive this was. If you were alive today, he would be in some kind of 12-step program
Yes.
for, dealing with them. It goes right through the end of his life. He's like a cheerleader for one invention, one, business venture after another.
Yeah. And now, before I pass you back to Ryan, just wanted to know what you hope readers take away upon finishing this fantastic book.
There's so many different, themes to the book. We really haven't discussed race, because I think
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
of the controversy about Huck Finn, and the N word is there 200 times. It somehow has created, kind of unfairly, an association in people's minds, Mark Twain racism. And he was really the opposite of racist. That Huck Finn, I think, remains the great anti-slavery novel.
Well, and his relationship with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, I love that
Fisk
part.
Jubilee Singers, yeah, this was an a cappella group that was promoting, helping to finance Fisk College, which had been started after the Civil War in Nashville, educating people born into slavery. He ends up, paying the full expenses for two Black students, one at Lincoln College, historically Black college in Pennsylvania. The other, a very fascinating story, Warner T. McGuinn, who's a brilliant law student at Yale Law School. And Warner T. McGuinn had been living, when Twain met him at Yale Law School, was living with the college's Black carpenter and doing odd jobs. And Twain writes to the dean of Yale Law School. He said, we have ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it. And he pays for Warner McGuinn's education. It has kind of major consequences, not just for Warner McGuinn, but American education, because Warner McGuinn then becomes a famous lawyer in Baltimore. He argues a major housing desegregation case. And there's a young lawyer, a young black lawyer in the next office named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall said that Warner T. McGuinn was one of the greatest lawyers he ever met, and had he not been black, would have been a judge. And then Thurgood Marshall, of course, argues Brown versus Board of Ed, becomes the first black associate justice, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of nice, Mark Twain, Warner T. McGuinn, all the way up to Brown versus Board of Ed.
Wow. Well, there's so much more I could want to talk to you
Yeah,
about, but I'm going to pass you over to Ryan because our chat is blowing up. Thank you so much
my
for a
pleasure.
fantastic half hour.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Gina. It was awesome to listen to. For those who know our program well, they know that we always begin this part of the program with our history student scholar question of the week. In sum, this is a weekly competition in which students from really all over the world have an opportunity to ask a question of our great guests, and they will potentially win not only having their question read aloud on air, but also a $50 gift card for themselves and their teacher. And questions are always excellent, and this week is no exception. Our winner is Ruby, who is a student at Stuyvesant High School, not too far from Gina and myself, and I think Ron as well, in Midtown Manhattan. Ruby is a student in Miss Madden's class, and the question is this. What do you think is Ron's most, I'm sorry, Mark Twain's, what do you think is Twain's most underrated work and why?
Maybe you must remember. Like I just tell, the books that no one reads anymore. My favorite is actually his first book called The Innocents Abroad. It actually was his best-selling book. It sold 100,000 copies. It was the bestseller of all time in his career. And what happened was that he signed on as a reporter with a kind of early tourist cruise to Europe and the Holy Land. And he's reporting back. He's not only satirizing all the places they see, but also his fellow passengers. And it was at a time when Americans tended to fawn on European culture. And Mark Twain skewers everything that he sees. I mean, it was, I think what excited me as a writer, I could feel that he was feeling his own powers for the first time. And the writing it's brash, it's irreverent, it's hilarious, it's tremendously energetic. And it's fun to watch him smash one sacred cow after another. They spend a lot of time in museums, and he grew tired of the old masters. He said, "The old masters are all dead, and I only wish they had died sooner." They go to the Sistine Chapel, and he calls it Michelangelo's nightmare. They go to Milan. He goes to see Da Vinci's Last Supper, and he said there were a dozen people painting copies of it. He said, I couldn't help but notice that all the copies were superior to the original. So I mean, this is really what becomes quintessential Mark Twain, of daring to think and then say what other people probably maybe would dare to think and not say aloud. So I just find it's funny and delightful, and just what I used before. It has a kind of anarchic quality. They go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because one of the most sacred places, maybe the most sacred place in Christianity. And at that time, no longer, but at that time, it was thought that Adam's tomb was in the church. So Mark Twain said, and I was wandering around in the church, and then he said, and I saw the tomb of an ancestor, Adam, and I fell to my knees and wept with emotion.
Too
So
funny.
it's a delightful book that I would recommend to anyone. And then after his next book, Roughing It, about his adventures out west, even though a lot of it was pure invention, also hilarious. So I have something of a bias towards the earlier books that were kind of filled with a sparkle that the later books, I think, lacked.
Oh, awesome. That's too funny. And thanks to Ruby for that great question, and of course, the answer from Ron. So many questions. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Adam is wondering, what was Twain's thinking on religion? What influenced his thinkings on religion? And was it at odds with others of his time, his thoughts on
Oh,
religion?
that's an excellent question. I wish it came up kind of more often. He had very, very deep and cynical and pessimistic views about religion. Maybe not about religion per se, but of much of organized religion, particularly organized Christianity, as we know it. Just to give you a sample of a couple of the shocking things that he wrote, he said that if Christ came back today, the one thing he would not be was a Christian. Another one of kind of the Mark Twain quotes, not one of the quotes that kind of constantly repeated, was that what did he say? Oh yeah, there was only one Christian. He was caught early and crucified. So interestingly, he had wonderful things to say about the Jews. Throughout his life, he was a champion of the Jews. He said that the Jews were the most marvelous race on the planet. He said they were kind of the intellectual aristocracy. He then kind of stumbled into a number of stereotypes about the Jews. He said that he didn't think that anti-Semitism had risen Christianity because of the crucifixion. He said it's because the Jews are money getters and they make more than the Christians, that the Christians envy and resent them. So sometimes in kind of in the course of defending the Jews, he would sometimes stumble into his own set of stereotypes, but clearly he felt very, very warmly about the Jews. His feelings in terms of organized Christianity, I guess stemming from his childhood, were very complicated.
Yes, great question and great answer. Olivia is also a student at Stuyvesant High School, and she says that I recently went on a field trip with her A-Push class to Grant's tomb, and she remembers learning that Twain and Grant knew each other. And you mentioned that previously. You mentioned also previously that Twain had few male acquaintances. Can you just talk a little bit more about the
Yeah, thank you
unique
so much
relationship?
yeah, thank you so much for asking that, because it was actually, Mark Twain started his own publishing company called Charles Webster and Company, and they had a tremendous first year. Their first two books were The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant was arguably the best-selling book of the 19th century. So Twain imagines that he has this flair for publishing. So he became very, very close friends with Ulysses S. Grant, who had decided to write the personal memoirs for two reasons. He'd been wiped out by this Ponzi schemer named Ferdinand Ward. At the same time, he discovered he had cancer of the throat and tongue. He was afraid that he would leave his wife destitute. So he decided that he would write the memoirs and then she would then be able to live off the royalties, which is what happened. And so Mark Twain became his publisher. A lot of people imagine Twain wrote the book. He did not write the book. He said his involvement went no further than grammar and spelling. And I think that that's true. But the two men became such warm friends. And there were a number of lines that Twain said about Ulysses S. Grant that I wish I'd had when I wrote the Grant biography. He said of Grant, he said Grant had the kindest nature and the purest character of anyone I'd ever met. He said that Ulysses S. Grant was the greatest person he'd ever had the chance to personally get to know. And then I think the most beautiful line of all, when Grant died, and he saw Grant dying with such dignity and stoicism, he wrote to Livy, he said, manifestly, dying is nothing to a really great and brave man. So Mark Twain, who was so cynical about so many people, these are kind of great testimonials to the character and personality of Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes, absolutely. Homer asks if Twain was familiar with the lost cause narrative that was sort of building in the 1870s and 80s and or even beyond, and if he had any thoughts and views about that, Reconstruction,
Yeah, these are
etc.
all such excellent, excellent questions. Pleasure to answer them. Yeah, because he publishes, Huck Finn, what, in 1885, and it's an anti-slavery book. So one could say, well, okay, slavery had ended 20 years before, so what? Isn't it a little late, to be anti-slavery? But what happened in the South after the Civil War, that there arose this school of historians, the Lost Cause School, And what they were arguing was not only that Robert E. Lee was a greater general than Ulysses S. Grant, and they were arguing that it was a war of northern aggression, not a rebellion or a civil war. But also one thing that they argued was that they tried to rewrite history and make it seem that all of the enslaved population was very happy until they were stirred up by abolitionists. And so because there was this kind of retrospective rewriting of history about what had actually happened during slavery, I think that in Huck Finn, Mark Twain is really addressing the lost cause theorists. And here's this, Black man at tremendous risk to his own life, escaping down the Mississippi River, and he's been, separated from his family. And so it might, at that late date, seem unnecessary to write an anti-slavery novel, but as your questioner seems to know, there was this large movement in the South that not only was slavery not harmful, but slaves were all very happy, and Southern culture was very genteel and patrician, a little bit like the old Gone with the Wind movie.
Wow, fascinating. Ron, as you know, we have so many teachers logging in today from all across the country, and too many to mention or asking me in the chat just why Twain is important for students today to know about, to learn about, and in conjunction with this great book that's by you that's coming out, and what work by Twain do you think is most important or is the best kind of teaching tool for teachers in the classroom today? In your opinion? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good it's a very good question. Well, let me talk a little bit about Huck Finn because I think that it is his masterpiece, although it's a flawed masterpiece. And there have been two areas of controversy. One has been in terms of the portrait of Jim, that going back 67 years, critics, Black critics, but not only Black critics, were arguing that there were certain minstrel affectations in the portrait of Jim. Now, Jim, I have to say, is in a way the most kind and sensitive, and honorable and dignified person in the entire book. Almost all the books, well, almost all the whites in the book are violent and crude and profane. But Jim is very superstitious. He's very credulous, and so Black critics, argued that this was kind of something you would see in minstrel shows, but not in reality. I think it was, I'm sure, one of the motivations for Percival Everett to write his wonderful novel James, telling the story, from Jim James's point of view, and showing that a lot of that kind of superstition and kind of slave pattern, that was the way that the enslaved population kept the whites, at bay. And then the other problem with Huck Finn has been the N-word, which, state the obvious, he's using it not to endorse slavery, but to expose how pervasive slavery was, among the whites at the time. There's actually, I was struck when Percival Everett's book came out. I started getting a lot of emails from friends. Our book group is reading James. And then always a month or two later, I'd get another email. Our book group is now reading Huck Finn. And so it's actually a wonderful idea, I think, educationally, to read those books back to back, and to kind of have a dialogue between past and present.
Yeah, absolutely. And you answered a question that I was about to ask because more than a few people were asking your thoughts on that novel.
Yeah.
Speaking of questions that more than a few people are asking in the chat, just if you could talk a little bit about Twain's anti-imperial nature and how that kind of came to be. Was he criticized for that in his own time?
Yeah, I'm so glad someone brought it up because this is a big part of the book. I tried to reconstruct the evolution of his political beliefs from being really very apolitical early in his life, being wildly, political later on, and he was a man of very strong opinions. He was always afraid earlier in his career that if he expressed his true opinions, he would alienate his loyal readers who saw him as the beloved humorist. Up through the 1890s, he's really kind of an American imperialist in many ways. By his own admission, he said, he said it was red hot to see the American eagle, soaring across the Pacific. What changes is this. During the Spanish-American War, he's very much in favor of the war. He feels that the US is fighting on behalf of Cuban insurgents against these Spanish colonial overlords. He feels it's an honorable war, and he's almost kind of jingoistic about it. But then what happens is, a consequence of the war, the US, among other things, takes over the Philippines. And he feels that the Philippines, he thought we had gone into the Philippines in order to redeem the Philippines, in order to liberate them, give them their own republic. And instead, he discovers that the US has gone in to subjugate the people. And there were a lot of atrocities that were happening. And he got up, it was around 1901, 1902. He got up at a banquet in New York, and he started talking about American occupation of the Philippines, because this had really soured him completely on US imperialism. He suddenly had become this major anti-imperialism voice. And he said that our soldiers in the Philippines were marching with disgraced muskets under a polluted flag. Well, that was really strong language, kind of criticize the government, in the middle of a war. They were shocked in the room. In fact, someone else immediately kind of ran up to the podium and said, "No, they're not, fighting with disgraced muskets under a polluted flag." And his speeches, his essays, anti-imperialist, were circulated as pamphlets by the anti-imperial league. And he also, and this is quite great courage, someone asked about his religious views. He wrote a lot about China, the Boxer Rebellion. He said, "I'm a Boxer." He sympathized with the Chinese nationalists, not with the Europeans. And he was especially critical of the Christian missionaries in China. And he felt that they were kind of agents of American imperialism. Well, it was difficult enough, controversial enough to criticize imperialism, but to criticize missionaries, it was probably the one time, because his wife Livy had a tremendous impact on him. I think it was kind of the one time where she tried to stop him from publishing something and failed. She really felt that if you could get into criticizing, Christian missionaries, that was like a bridge too far for her.
Wow. Fascinating. Another great, and I'm just keeping an eye on time, try to get to one or two more questions, if that's okay. Another great question from Israt, who's another high school student, who says, "I've always thought of Mark Twain as witty, almost rebellious voice in American literature. But in your book, how do you see Twain wrestling with the contradictions of America, like race, wealth, empire? And do you think humor was his way of confronting really serious issues or avoiding them?"
I think absolutely confronting them, exposing them. Mark Twain is interesting because we think of him as the quintessential American. I discovered he wrote in his notebook, "I am not an American, I am the American," which seems like a rather arrogant thing to say, but I guess that there was some truth in it. He does embody in his nature both the best, but sometimes the worst of American culture. I know some of their views have kind of rebelled against this because they want to, kind of cling to the image of the merry man, with the cigars and the jokes. And he was a much more serious and figure than that. So I think he represents the best of America in terms of this irreverence towards the rich and powerful. He took on colonialism, aristocracy, monarchy, slavery. He was very kind of democratic, small d, in that way. But he also, I discovered, when he wasn't satirizing the plutocrats, he was doing his damnedest to become one. And again, he not only wanted to make money, he wanted to make so much money that he would, as he said at one point, he wanted to become part of the Vanderbilt gang. And so if you kind of read his books, because he was constantly satirizing these money mad characters, you would say, oh, Mark Twain would never be, would never act like that. But Mark Twain in his private business life was often, acting like that. So I think that part of the fun of writing about him, I hope part of the fun of reading about him, is that you're kind of wrestling with the nature of this extremely contradictory man.
Y- Yes, absolutely. And Erica asks, one of our great teachers in the network says that, so much about biography is, and reading biography is kind of getting and reading about the traits that are those impressive traits, those admirable traits in other people's lives. And just wondering what you think is Mark Twain's most admirable or important character trait.
I think the most admirable one is just sympathy with the underdog. And it was sympathy with the underdog, not only in the United States, but globally. I was talking about his attitude about American imperialism. Well, during that period, he writes a satirical pamphlet attacking the violence of the Tsar in Russia. He writes a satirical pamphlet attacking King Leopold II for his depredations in the Belgian colony. You probably know the story, that he was trying to extract rubber. If the local people did not come up with their quotas in rubber, he would, cut off their hands. Booker T. Washington said that issue stirred up Mark Twain more than any other issue. So it's kind of not just the evils that he can directly, see at home that tend to exercise him, but he, rages against injustice everywhere. At his best, I think he really acted as conscience of American society. He was the all-purpose political pundit. His record was not perfect. The one issue that I wish he'd gone farther with was the lynching issue. He started fairly early on collecting a file of articles on lynching. He was particularly upset at one point. He found out that there had been 2 or 3 lynchings in the neighborhood of his old town of Hannibal, Missouri. And he had actually projected doing a book on the history of lynching in the United States. So he felt so strongly about it. It didn't happen. He ended up writing an essay called The United States of Lyncherdom, where he did deal with it. It's not entirely satisfactory, but he's moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, it was not published during his lifetime. So even though he became so fearless and so outspoken on so many topics, there still remained that fear. He had many, many readers in the South. And I think that to take on, lynching so openly, I guess was just more than he was willing to risk. But in terms of the number of issues that he did take on, it was really rather impressive and often got him in all sorts of trouble.
Yes, absolutely. Before I throw things back to Gina for some final thoughts and look ahead to next week, just wanted to again to thank you for your contributions and everything to Gilder Lehrman and specifically the Hamilton program. And wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about, I know the 3 of us with Gina were talking a little bit about how that all came to be. If you could just share a little bit of brief insights with our audience, I think everyone
Sure.
would
Well, you
really
all know,
love it.
the musical was inspired by my biography, so I was very, very involved over a 7-year period in its creation. And then the show opened, and what happened, we became a casualty of our own success, that the show was so popular that it was almost impossible to get tickets. If you could get tickets, you had to pay an outrageous amount of money for it. And so, we had not created the show just so that rich Wall Street people could go and see it. And so there are a number of things. They started having a lottery, $10, for the first row in each performance. But also, I ended up introducing our lead producer, Jeffrey Seller, to Jim Basker and the folks at Gilder Lehrman, because they were looking for a program that would allow large numbers of New York high school students to see the show and interact with the cast. And Gilda Lamb has done a fantastic job. It's called the Edge of Ham, program. I've seen figures. They're probably now very dated. 250,000 high school students have seen the show. So it was like one matinee every Wednesday. I don't know if this is still the case. And so what they would do, the students would create their own performance pieces in the style of the musical and of the period. And then the best ones would be performed on stage. They would then see a performance of Hamilton. They would either see it for $10. If they couldn't afford that, they would see it for free. And then afterwards, there would be a talk back, with the cast. So, and then this was sort of repeated in other companies, in other cities. And so I think that I think I probably speak for many of the people involved with the show. This is as important a byproduct of the show as anything that we did. Because I felt on one hand, when the show opened, it originated at the Public Theater down in the Village. The first preview, people were coming up to me and saying, "Ron, I love the show," but as I was watching it, I was so embarrassed to realize how little I knew about the history of my own country, and I'm going to change that. And they started reading. So I think that the show has inspired millions of people to start reading American history, and it's extremely important. So I think that that's one of the two most important things. And then I think the other thing is just this Gilda Lamb and Edgerham project that has introduced so many high school students to Hamilton in that period of American history. And a lot of the students come from, poor neighborhoods. In many of the cases, I remember I would speak to the students at the matinees, and they would tell me it was like their first time in the Broadway theater, maybe even their first time in the theater district. So it opened a whole world of possibility in terms of their cultural life, and then a whole world of possibility in terms of study of American history.
Absolutely. We're proud of the program, and I know it's you are too, and it's an awesome collaborative. So and continuing to this day. Ron, this was awesome. So sorry to all the people who we didn't have time to get to your questions. Get your hands on this book. There's links in the chat to do so, and your questions can be answered there. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts.
Yes, and I also just put in the chat a link to our Hamilton Education Program, which you can also look at online, and students and teachers and anyone interested in the world of Hamilton can peruse through. Thank you so much, Ron. It was such an honor to have you here today. I think,
This has been
for
such a
anyone.
pleasure. I have to tell you that these are the best questions I think that I have had so far. They were just so smart.
Oh, well, that's what we love to hear. And we hope that everyone will join us next week when we hear about the life of Boutwell, the radical Republican and champion of democracy. We'll be welcoming that author next week. And Ron, thank you. And everybody, you can go online at gilderlehrman.org for historical documents, History Now, online exhibitions. As I had mentioned, the Hamilton Education Program, the link is in that chat. Ron, thank you so much. It's always an honor to have you here with us.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, folks, for spending time on a Sunday afternoon.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.